Hello and welcome, ladies and gents, boys and girls, story lovers all over the world, to another fascinating episode of Never Lost, where we retell and talk about the old Scots folk tales and fairy stories so that they will never be forgotten. Today, we're going to talk about the story that we told in the last episode, Katie Crackernuts. But in a slight break from the normal format, I have not written a poem inspired by this story. The main reason for that is that I really want to write a long narrative poetry version of the story, and I frankly can't do that in just 1 week. Also, though, there is so much I can talk about surrounding the story of Katie Crackernuts that this episode is going to be plenty long as it is. For one thing, in researching the story, I've discovered a number of similar but different stories from other countries, which I will briefly be retelling. So, without further ado, let's sit back and start talking about the story. Katie Crackernuts is a fantastic Scots fairy tale, which was first collected by the Scottish poet and novelist Andrew Lang. He published the story for the first time in 1889, after recording it from the oral tradition while on a trip to the Orkney Islands, just off the north coast of Scotland. The story has been retold and adapted many times over the years, but in essence it stayed very true to the original, which we can assume was very close to the oral traditional version. I love the story of Katie Crackernuts for so many reasons. It centres around another fabulous, strong female character, Katie, who is not just proactive and self assured, but smart and practical as well. When she's travelling through an unknown forest, Katie leaves a trail of nuts behind her just in case she needs to find her way back. She ultimately doesn't need to find her way back, but I like the fact that an unnecessary detail like that was included in the story. It's a level of character reinforcement that we seldom see in short fairy stories. We would normally be told that this person is smart and practical, and then we'd only see them doing smart or practical things which are directly related to the narrative. Katie is also more than just a strong female character. She is very definitely a heroine. She doesn't just proactively help herself, not requiring rescuing by a handsome prince. Katie goes out and finds and rescues her own prince from the clutches of capricious fairies. Today, in the 21st century, that's nothing out of the ordinary in storytelling. But in the 1800s, this was rare to find such an independent and empowered female character. The story also contains the ubiquitous evil stepmother and queen figure, but the original tale only touches on the subject. And the ending that I used in my retelling, where we see a closing of that story arc, I've only heard in oral tellings of the story, and I couldn't find in any of the written versions. It's also a story of sisterhood. When Princess Velvet Cheek's head is replaced by a sheep's head, she flees her cruel stepmother along with her beloved sister Katie, and together the two young women go out into the world, and eventually Katie is able to cure her sister of the witch's spell which is cast upon her. Another trope we see in Katie Crackernuts is the old henwife who lives alone in a cottage. A henwife was in reality exactly what it says on the tin. Historically, the title of wife didn't mean spouse, it simply meant woman. The medieval jobs of fishwife or alewife or henwife, for example, were often done by unmarried women. And the Old English word for mermaid was merewife, mere meaning of the sea and wife meaning woman. In folk fiction, though, a henwife is almost always a label given to a witch or a wise woman. She is the old crone who lives by herself in the woods and mixes potions and spells for the villain. Or the old woman in the cottage who advises the hero on which path to take, the giver of good advice, or the keeper of secret knowledge. In Katie Crackernuts, the henwife is most definitely a witch. She is the one who the evil stepmother goes to for a spell to destroy the beauty of the stepdaughter that she resents. Interestingly, though, it takes 3 attempts before the spell actually succeeds. This is another very common motif in folk and fairy tales. Threes pop up everywhere in various forms, from the literal, such as 3 bears, 3 little pigs, 3 billy goats, to the narrative, such as the hero having to try to do something 3 times before succeeding, or two princes failing a task before the third succeeds. What's unusual about Katie Crackernuts is that the story applies the rule of 3 to the witch. Normally, if a villain wants to do something, they just get to do it. They don't have to overcome any obstacle twice before succeeding. It didn't take 3 attempts to get Snow White to bite the poisoned apple, or Sleeping Beauty to prick her finger. I personally really like this use of the rule of 3, and I'll be interested to see if I can find it in other Scots folktales. I hope I do, because I think it makes normally one-dimensional side characters and villains more dynamic and believable, and it ultimately improves the story. I mean, how much better would Little Red Riding Hood have been if the big bad wolf had tried 2 other cottages first, where less helpless grandmothers lived, and as soon as he popped his nose through the door, it was met with a cast iron frying pan to the muzzle? So, that was some of the reasons why I love the story of Katie Crackernuts. Now, let's get into the real meat and potatoes of today's episode, which is the similar stories from other places that use the same motifs and tropes as Katie Crackernuts. I'm going into detail about them for 2 reasons. Firstly, they're great stories that are as bonkers and sometimes more insane than Katie Crackernuts. And secondly, because I recently discovered an incredible folktale resource, the Arne Thompson Uther Index, which catalogues hundreds of fairy stories and folktales according to their themes and their tropes and their motifs. The main 2 themes of Katie Crackernuts are listed as ATU Type 306, which is the Danced Out Shoes story, and ATU Type 711, which is the Beautiful and Ugly Twin story. We will look at a few similar tales of the first type, Type 306 first. This type was the Danced Out Shoes. The trope is more about a magical dance that is attended willingly or not by a person or persons each night. However, the 2 examples that I've chosen to tell are footwear focused. The earliest written story of this type comes from 1815, and it can be found in the second volume of the first collection of fairy stories written down by folktale legends, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. The brothers Grimm called this story The Shoes That Were Danced to Pieces, or The 12 Dancing Princesses. So without further ado, let's sit back and start a shortened version of this story. Once upon a time, there lived a king who had 12 beautiful daughters. Whether or not these daughters were from different women, or from one poor, unfortunate queen forced into near constant childbirth, is not mentioned, nor is it narratively relevant. The 12 princesses all slept in 12 separate beds, in the same, presumably huge, bedroom. And at night, the king would lock his daughters in, perhaps as a defence against roving, randy princes. The odd thing was that when the king unlocked the door each morning, the princesses' shoes were all tattered and torn to shreds. The 12 princesses claimed that they had no idea what could have possibly caused this. The king was frustrated by this strange state of affairs. For one thing, princesses' shoes were not cheap, and at a rate of 12 pairs per day, he was quickly becoming less wealthy, while the local shoemaker was becoming a very rich man. So, the king announced that anybody who could solve this perplexing mystery would get one of his daughter's hand in marriage, and his throne when he eventually passed away. Presuming that is, that he hadn't been forced to sell it by that time to buy shoes. However, as this is a story from the Brothers Grimm, you won't be surprised to learn that anybody who tried and after 3 days had failed to solve the mystery was executed. Despite the harsh punishment for failure, many young men volunteered. A large and comfy chair was put in the princess's bedroom so that the young men might keep watch over the princesses as they slept and find out what was going on. However, each night the watcher would fall asleep in the chair after drinking a cup of wine, which one of the princesses gave him, and when he woke up, the 12 princesses would be in their beds and their shoes would be ruined. This pattern repeated itself over and over, until all of the volunteers had failed and subsequently been beheaded. It's now that we meet our protagonist. An old soldier is returning to the kingdom, and on the road he meets an old woman. He tells her of his intention to try and solve the mystery and claim the king's reward. The old wise woman warns the soldier not to drink the wine that the princesses give him, because it will put him to sleep. How she could possibly know this isn't mentioned, but old women in fairy stories are often privy to strange and often inexplicable knowledge. She also gives the soldier a cloak of invisibility, which could be seen as a dangerous gift to give to an old soldier who is about to start a job where he has to essentially spy on young women in their bedroom. But we have to assume that the old wise woman knows what she's doing. The soldier volunteers to solve the king's ruined shoes mystery, and in no time at all he's in the bedroom and being offered obviously drugged wine by one of the princesses. Rather than refusing the wine, which might look suspicious, the soldier sellotapes a sponge to his chin and pretends to drink the wine while in fact dribbling it down his chin to be absorbed by the sponge. Then he lies back in the chair and begins snoring loudly, pretending to be asleep. The princesses now all get up and have a good laugh at the soldier, who they assume is asleep and will be executed in 2 days' time, like all the others. These are some seriously mean girls who seem to revel in the fact that they have essentially already caused the deaths of numerous young men and are about to add another victim to their list. Next, the 12 princesses all get dressed and prepare themselves for the fairy tale equivalent of a secret rave, and the oldest princess knocks 3 times on her bed, revealing a secret passageway underneath it. The soldier watches the princesses descend into the passage. Then he throws on his cloak of invisibility and follows them. The passage leads to a magic forest full of trees with gold and silver and diamond leaves. The soldier breaks off branches from each kind of tree, and in doing so, more than once nearly reveals himself. The youngest princess hears him breaking the branches, and she warns her sisters that something doesn't feel right. The soldier also, at one point, accidentally steps on the youngest princess's gown, but when she voices her alarm, the oldest princess tells her to shut up and calls her a snow goose. Past the forest of unimaginable wealth, the 12 princesses, with the soldier still following, reach a body of water where 12 handsome princes are waiting with 12 rowing boats. Somehow the soldier manages to sneak unnoticed into the boat with the youngest princess, and all 12 princes begin rowing their partners across the water. The prince rowing the youngest princess does remark that it's much harder work that night for some reason, but this only serves to make the young princess feel fat. On the far side of the water is a beautiful and brightly lit castle, where joyous music is playing and the secret rave is in full swing. Once the boats are moored, the 12 princesses and 12 princes go into the castle and party like it's 1599, until around 3 a.m., by which time the princesses' shoes are literally torn to shreds from the incredible force of the princesses partying. The 12 princes now row everyone, including the still invisible soldier, back across the water. When they get back to dry land, the soldier quickly runs ahead of the 12 princesses, back through the forest of unimaginable wealth and the secret passageway into the bedroom, and resumes his place, pretending to be asleep on the chair. The princesses get back shortly after the soldier and quickly change out of their party clothes and back into their nightgowns. The entrance to the secret passage conceals itself, and the princesses go to sleep with a pair of ruined shoes at the foot of each bed. Even though the soldier has now solved the mystery, and he could easily now claim his reward, he decides not to tell the king right away, because he wants to see the beautiful sight again. Whether the old soldier means the sight of the beautiful castle, or the sight of the 12 princesses changing out of and back into their nightgowns, is left to the imagination. Regardless of his reasoning, the soldier follows the 12 princesses out of the castle for the next 2 nights, and before his final journey back, he steals a golden cup that the princesses were drinking wine from as further proof of his story. The morning after the third night, the old soldier stands before the king with the 12 princesses behind him and tells the monarch exactly what his daughters have been getting up to. He also gives the king the golden cup that he took from the castle and the branches with leaves of gold, silver, and diamond. The princesses have no choice but to admit that the soldier's story was true, and the soldier claims his reward, choosing the oldest princess as his new bride. The 12 princes, who presumably live in the same castle, were cursed by the king for as many nights as they had spent dancing with the princesses, although what that curse could be is not specified. That's the end of the story of the 12 dancing princesses, or the shoes that were danced to pieces. Although it uses a similar trope of going somewhere magical to dance the night away, it's also a very different story to Kate Crackernuts. In this story, nobody is bewitched into dancing. The princesses just really want to party. The ending for me is also a little unfair on the poor 12 princes. All they were really guilty of was hooking up with 12 hot women and going to an all night secret rave. For this, they were punished with an ambiguous curse. The princesses, on the other hand, were guilty of repeatedly administering a magical date rape drug to numerous young men and then letting them be executed just so that they could keep partying, and they got off scot-free. Another notable thing in the story was the forest of trees with gold, silver, and diamond leaves. This is reminiscent of a very similar garden in the Sumerian epic Gilgamesh. The story also falls into a type of folk tale known as do or die stories, where the hero is given a task that if he doesn't complete, he will be killed. Usually, just like in this story, the hero is preceded by a number of people who have tried, failed, and died. Interestingly, later versions and retellings of the story remove the do or die nature of the story, instead having the previous young men who failed vanish or become trapped in the underground castle. Andrew Lang, who first published Kate Crackernuts, actually released a version of the 12 Dancing Princesses in his 1857 collection, The Red Fairy Book. This version has the previous young men vanish, and it also removes the princesses drugging the young men. These revisions are most likely a reaction to English Victorian public opinion. Self-help was a big thing for Victorian people, and they didn't like the idea of people trying and then being punished for failure. Also, the Victorian ideal of women, and royalty in particular, is probably why the princesses drugging the young men was removed. One last lovely thing about Andrew Lang's version of the story is that it contains a small literary nod to the story of The Princess and the Pea by Hans Christian Andersen. When the princesses are described in Andrew Lang's version, it is said that they were so very sensitive and of such royal blood that they would have felt at once the presence of a pea in their beds, even if the mattresses had been laid over it. So, that pretty much wraps up the 12 Dancing Princesses. Now, let's get into the next Danced Out Shoes story. And if you think the last story was wild, then strap in. This one's insane. It comes from a book called Gypsy Folk Tales, written by Francis Hinds Groom and published in 1899. So without further ado, let's sit back and start another story. A long, long time ago, it came to pass that a king had 3 daughters, princesses. They were all 3 quite beautiful and good-mannered young maidens, and the king was well pleased with them. The strange thing, though, was that each morning the princesses' shoes were found torn to shreds. In puzzled bewilderment, the king asked one of his good servants, a man named Jankos, to investigate the mystery. Jankos decides to spy upon the princesses to see if they're sneaking out. But before his first vigil, he is warned by a wise old gypsy woman that the princesses are being visited each night by 3 devils. She warns Jankos that the devils will know he is in the bedroom and that he must feign death while the devils throw fire on him and stab him with needles. Jankos hides in the bedroom, and sure enough, the devils do know he's there. But after throwing some fire on him and stabbing Jankos with a few needles, the devils believe that he's dead, and they open a magic trapdoor in the floor and take the princesses into a secret passage that leads to hell. Jankos follows the princesses into the passage, presumably after extinguishing himself, On and on they walk, through a forest of diamond, a forest of glass, and a forest of gold. Jankos breaks branches off the trees, and the princesses hear him and warn the devils, but they tell the girls to shut up and that they don't care. Once they reach hell, the princesses begin to dance the night away, and Jankos hides under a bed and watches. The reason that there's a bed in hell will become relevant shortly. Before long, the princesses' shoes are torn to shreds from the dancing. You might think that princesses' shoes would be more sturdily made, but in fact, they are dancing on a floor made of knives, so even Doc Martens would be hard pressed to hold up. Next, once the shoes were completely ruined, the devils go on to lay the two older princesses on the bed that Jankos is hiding under and proceed to dance under the sheets with the two women. The youngest princess refused to lie with the devils, and they didn't force her, because the minions of Satan have a certain amount of style, and some things are beneath even devils. While the devils are distracted by their royal rumpy-pumpy session, Jankos sneaks out from under the bed and legs it back through the forest, up the passageway, and back into the castle. Not long after that, the three devils return the three princesses to their room. In the morning, with the princesses present, Jankos tells the king everything that he had seen the night before. In response to this, the king pulls out his rifle and shoots both of his older daughters dead, and then cuts both of their bellies open to scatter any spawns of Satan that may be growing inside them. The story is not done yet, though. The king has his two dead daughters buried, and he posts soldiers to guard their graves. However, every night the soldiers guarding the graves are ripped apart by the tormented spirits of the dead princesses. This goes on for a while, until over 100 soldiers had been killed, and the king began to run out of soldiers. Finally, the king was down to his last new recruit, his entire standing army having been murdered by the ghosts of his dead daughters. So it falls to this poor last remaining soldier and Jankos to guard the graves. Fortunately for them, a wise little old man comes up to them before nightfall and tells them how to lift the curse. The moment the ghosts come out of the princesses' coffins, the two men have to jump into the coffins and not come out no matter what happens. At the appointed time, Jankos and the young soldier jump into the coffins when the ghosts come out. The princesses' ghosts are furious, and they proceed to scream and throw more fire onto the two men. Luckily, Jankos had expected this, following his experience with the devils, and he had doused himself and the other man in water before they got into the coffins. As a result of this, the ghosts' attacks are useless, and by morning the two princesses were not just at rest, but had miraculously come back to life, even more beautiful than they had been before. The king was so happy at the miraculous resurrection of his daughters that he allowed Jankos to marry one and the young soldier to marry the other, and they all lived happily ever after. That's the end of the insane gypsy folktale, The Three Girls. As a story, it's far closer to the 12 Dancing Princesses than Kate Crackernuts. Both of those stories have the mystery of the princess's ruined shoes, and we see the protagonist passing through a very similar forests of trees with leaves of gold and diamond and either silver or glass. But there are obvious differences as well. The three princesses in the second story were tempted by devils instead of just wanting to party, and two of them earned the harsh punishment of being shot and disemboweled for sleeping with devils. The protagonist in The Three Girls, Jankos, has a much harder time of it than the soldier in the 12 Dancing Princesses. The soldier achieves his task by doing little more than some light stalking with the help of a cloak of invisibility. Poor Jankos has to pretend to be dead while he's being stabbed with needles and set on fire. Then he has to hide under a bed in hell while devils fornicate above him. And finally, he has to lie in a coffin alongside the corpse of a princess while two ghosts try to set him on fire again. If anybody ever deserved his reward at the end of his trials, it's Jankos. Before we finish today, I have one more story to recount. It's the other story type that Kate Crackernuts falls into, ATU type 711, the beautiful and ugly twin. The tale I've chosen is called Tatterhood, and it comes from Norway. The beautiful and ugly twin type is not a common sort of story outside of Scandinavian countries. However, there are many examples from Iceland and Norway. The story was originally recorded by Peter Christian Asbjornsen and Jürgen Moe, but alternate versions were later included in Ruth Manning Sanders' collections A Choice of Magic and A Book of Witches. I'm going to recount a slight mix of the Norse and the Anglicised versions, because the later versions are more compact, but the original Norse version contains some lovely quotes and imagery. So, without further ado, let's sit back and start the story of Tatterhood. A long time ago, in a far-off land, there lived a good king and queen. The royal couple ruled their land well and were loved by their subjects, but there was a great sadness in their lives. Although they had been together for many years, their union seemed cursed to never be blessed with a child. This caused the queen much grief, and she had few happy times. She was constantly bewailing and bemoaning herself about how quiet and lonesome it was in the castle, and how much happier it could be if they had but a babe. The king and queen adopt a little girl to alleviate the queen's loneliness, but though she loved and cared for the girl, the queen still craved a child of her own. One day, the queen's adopted daughter was playing in the castle courtyard with a golden apple when a beggar wife came by with a little girl of her own. Before long, the queen's daughter and the beggar wife's daughter were playing together, tossing the golden apple between them. The queen was watching from her window, and she called down to her adopted daughter to come up at once, for playing with beggars was not something a royal princess was meant to do. However, when the young girl came up, the beggar girl came with her, and the queen dismissed the beggar girl. As the beggar girl left, she murmured under her breath that the queen might not so quickly dismiss her if she knew of her mother's powers. The queen heard the beggar girl's comment, and she asked her exactly what she meant. The child said that she knew the queen's daughter was adopted, but her mother had the knowing of how the queen could have a daughter of her own. The queen didn't believe the girl, but the beggar girl insisted, and she bade the queen to ask her mother. The queen sent for the old woman, and did ask if she knew a way for the queen to have children of her own. The beggar woman told the queen that she shouldn't listen to the stories of beggars, and she strode out of the room. The queen was about to scold the beggar's daughter, but the young girl insisted that what she said was true, and she suggested that the queen get her mother pissed because strong drink always loosened the old woman's tongue. The queen sent for the old woman again, and she apologized for her earlier question and her harsh words to the woman's daughter. In recompense, she offered the old woman as much fine wine and honey mead as the woman wished to drink. Before long, the beggar woman was thoroughly sozzled, and laughing and joking along with the queen. Now the queen repeated her question. "One way, perhaps, I do know," said the old woman, in the slurred speech of the happily inebriated. Your your queenship first must bathe in a bath of river water. Then do not discard the water, for it contains your essence. Drag your marital bed to the lowest room in the castle. Then sprinkle the bath water under the bed before you lie with your husband. In the morning, 2 flowers will have sprung up, one fair and beautiful, and one ugly and withered. Your majest, your majest, your queenship must eat the fair flower, but leave the foul. It's very important, that last bit. Dinna eat the manky flower. Then the old woman passed out, and the queen had her thrown out. The queen, though, did as the beggar woman had instructed. She bathed in river water, then sprinkled the water under the bed, which had been moved to the lowest level room in the castle, and lo and behold, when she looked in the morning, 2 flowers had indeed sprouted under the bed, one fair and one ugly. The queen immediately picked and ate the pretty flower. However, it was so incredibly delicious that before she even registered what she was doing, she had eaten the ugly flower as well. These flowers were like Pringles, apparently. Once you pop, you can't stop. Despite doing exactly what the beggar woman had warned her not to do, the queen is soon with child, and 9 months later she goes into labour. Now, if the general inconveniences of pregnancy, such as nausea, swollen feet, incontinence, joint pain, bloating, vomiting, mood swings, and fatigue, hadn't already made the Queen regret her decision, then the birth of her first child certainly would, because the Queen's baby daughter burst from her loins, literally riding a goat and waving a wooden spoon. Luckily, the midwife in the room was looking at the business end of the birthing process, so to speak, and she warned everyone in the room to get back just before the goat riding baby came shooting out. If my mum's listening to this, then see, it could have been a lot worse. I may have been 8 pounds and had a head the size of a large turnip, but at least I wasn't riding a goat. The Queen's baby daughter rode around the room on the goat, waving the wooden spoon in the air and shouting "Mama." The baby girl was loud and brash, and not what you would call a pretty thing. Her hair was scraggly, her nose was large, and her beady eyes peered from her face, not unlike those of a pig. The Queen despaired at having birthed such an unattractive child. The fact that she had also birthed a goat seems not to have concerned her. As the Queen was lying in her bed, exhausted by the effort of giving birth to a baby and a goat simultaneously, the little girl rode the goat over to her and told her not to worry. The fair babe she so desired was still within her. And sure enough, a few minutes later, the Queen gave birth to a second, beautiful and normal baby girl. The second twin was lovely, with long blonde hair and blue eyes. She was also well behaved and polite, everything the Queen could want in a daughter. The first twin was undeniably clever. After all, she had been born already able to talk and ride a goat. However, she was also unruly and ill-mannered. She refused to wear dresses or pretty things, instead preferring to wear old breeches and a tattered robe with a hood which she kept permanently pulled up over her unkempt hair. Because of this, the people in the castle took to calling her Tatterhood. The two sisters were as different as two girls could be, both in looks and in personality. Where Tatterhood was self-assured and loud and unruly, her sister was quiet and demure and polite. Despite this, the two girls were as close as sisters could be and loved each other very much, spending all of their time together. The two girls grew into young women, happy in each other's company. After some time, the king and queen decided that the girls were nearly of an age when they should be married off, so a great ball was planned where the fair sister could be presented to the eligible nobility. The fair sister in the story isn't enthusiastic about this. She feels she's still too young, and she wishes one day to marry for love, not for convenience. Anyway, before the ball begins, there is a great uproar outside of the castle. A great crowd of witches and trolls and dryads and other mythological creatures have assembled. There's a great term in Norse mythology, actually, the unseelie court. The seelie court is the elven fairy creatures, and the unseelie court are all the slightly demonic beasts. And all of these unseelie creatures and witches are outside the castle shouting and waving clubs and things in the air and generally making a nuisance of themselves. Everyone is quite upset by this, except for Tatterhood, who actually leans out of a window and waves to some of them as if she knows them. Tatterhood tells everyone not to worry and that she will go down with her spoon and deal with this furious mob of hideous creatures. But before she does this, she speaks to her fair sister, telling her that when a girl is in trouble like this, she must be self-assured and unafraid. She says that barley must grow from the tongue when addressing such a mob. So Tatterhood goes down on her goat and holding her wooden spoon, and she shouts something like, "If my life be short, let my fame be great. Let herds of bears surround me. I shall put my hand in the mouth of Fenris the wolf, and I shall not count the cost. I suck on the breast of life, and I shall be a hard butcher for anyone who tries to take me from it." Then, with her sister watching from a window, Tatterhood charges the mob of monsters and witches and begins scattering them with great sweeps of her wooden spoon. In little time, the unseelie creatures are fleeing from this one angry girl waving a wooden spoon and riding a goat. However, the last of the witches to turn and run looks round, and she sees the fair sister leaning out of the window and watching, and she quickly reaches up and plucks her pretty head off and replaces it with the head of a calf. She puts the fair sister's head into a bag and then legs it with the rest of the unseelie mob. So, Tatterhood rides back into the castle on her goat after the battle, and her parents, the king and queen, are predictably freaking out because their beautiful daughter now has the head of a calf and is quietly mooing in the corner. And Tatterhood begins to scold the king and queen. She basically tells them that her sister is safer now with the head of a calf than she would have been before, because it's too early for her fair sister to be married off to somebody that she doesn't even know. She hasn't lived enough of her life yet to be tossed into wedlock. This being a Norse tale, though, Tatterhood says this in fabulously poetic language. She says that before any maid is wed, she should have a dress with 10,000 secrets sewn into it. When she's done belittling her parents, Tatterhood tells them that she knows where the long house of the witches and the wild women is, and that if her father gives her and her sister a boat, she will go and take her sister with her to retrieve her head, which is apparently hanging on a nail in the wall of the longhouse. Her father agrees, and he offers her 100 armed men to accompany them. But Tatterhood refuses, saying that this is an adventure for her and her sister, not a thing which can be solved with strength of arms. So off the sisters go together in the boat, and they cross a sea and a couple of fjords, sailing for many, many days, until at last they reach the land where the wild women live. From where the sisters anchor their boat, they can see the longhouse in the distance, and they know that it's the right one because carrying on the wind is a primal drumbeat, which I kid you not sounds like Tatterhood tells her sister to wait on the boat, and she sneaks up to the longhouse on her goat and peeks in the window. Inside, the Norse historic equivalent of an all-night rave is in full swing. The wild women are dancing and drinking and smoking. They're playing drums, obviously. There's a tattoo table set up in one corner. It is a party in the longhouse. So Tatterhood sneaks into the longhouse, and just as she prophesied, there is her sister's head on a nail on the wall. Except now her sister's head has 3 braided strands of silver hanging down her face. While the wild women are distracted with the dancing and the drinking and the Tatterhood creeps amongst them, and she steals back her sister's head and then legs it on her goat back to the boat. When she reaches the boat, she unscrews the calf's head from her sister's neck and screws her real head back on. By an odd coincidence, there happens to be a headless calf passing by at that exact moment that she screws the calf's head onto. Now, Tatterhood asks her sister how she feels, and her sister tells her that she feels amazing. She remembers everything that her head saw from the wall of the wild women's longhouse, and she now knows things that she never dreamed of. She's learned wisdom and self-assurance. She says she now knows 10,000 secrets. So Tatterhood gives her sister a choice. She says, we can return to our parents' castle, and you can marry Bjorn or Uthrid or whoever, or we can sail on together where the wind takes us and gather more stories and live more of our lives together. Her sister thinks for just a moment, stroking the threads of silver that now hang from her head, and then she decides to sail on with Tatterhood, and the 2 young women go on to have various adventures and garner great fame and notoriety across the lands as they sail the seas together for years. It was said that stories hung from the sides of their boat like the hides of animals. Anyway, eventually, the 2 young women reach a kingdom far to the north. When they get there, their fame has preceded them, and there are crowds of people in the street when they arrive. Tatterhood in particular is now well known as the amazing maiden who can defeat giants and trolls with just a wooden spoon. So the people are cheering like she's Taylor Swift and waving wooden spoons at her and clapping her on the back. Watching all this from the window of the town's castle is the king of the land and his son, the prince. Since Tatterhood and her sister are now super famous, they get invited to the castle for a feast so that the king can meet them. Now, this king has been in mourning for years after the death of his wife, but at the feast, when he meets the fair sister with the threads of silver in her hair, he feels a stirring in his heart, and before long he has fallen in love with her. So the king goes to Tatterhood and asks her permission to propose to her sister. Tatterhood is, after all, acting very much as her sister's protector, and also she's technically the older sister, by a few minutes at least. Tatterhood tells the king that she doesn't mind, but that where she is from, traditionally the older sister would marry first, before the younger sister. The king says, of course, he understands. It's the same in this land. Then he asks Tatterhood if there was anybody that she might have in mind to marry. And Tatterhood replies, your son, my liege, the prince. The prince is tall, fair, a sort of brooding lad whom many women wish to marry because he's the strong, silent type that women often think are deep and complex, when in fact they just have very little to say. So the king takes his son for a chat, and he says to the prince, have I ever asked anything of you, my son? And the prince says, no, never. And the king says, well, today is the day that all the crows come to roost on your house. Then the king explains that he's fallen in love with Tatterhood's sister, but that if they are to marry, then he, the prince, will have to marry Tatterhood. Now the prince shows himself here to be a real class act, in my opinion, and a great man. He says to his father, I was there when we buried my mother, and I have seen you ride on a horse made entirely of tears for a long time. If there is a chance that you can find any happiness in this world, then I will put my shoulder behind that chance. Not, it has to be said, that this is a completely selfless act by the prince. The young man is very intrigued by Tatterhood. Such a woman does not often cross one's path, he says. The king is overjoyed, and he runs off at once to propose to the fair sister, who by the way likes the king well enough and accepts his proposal. Not long after that, a lavish double wedding ceremony is planned in the chapel of the town, and the two royal couples are going through the streets in a sort of procession towards the chapel. The king and the fair sister are at the front of the parade on two magnificent white horses, and a short way behind them is the prince on his horse, with Tatterhood riding beside him on her goat. The king and the fair sister are shouting hails to people and waving and cheering, and the crowds are throwing flowers in front of the parade. But the prince seems even more broody and quiet than usual. Maybe, despite, as I said, being a class act, he probably never thought that he'd be marrying someone wearing a tattered hood, waving a wooden spoon, and riding a goat. But as they're riding through the town, Tatterhood turns to him and says something like, the problem with men is that you never know the questions to ask a woman to get her to open her soul towards you. My gift to you will be to tell you the questions you must ask me to open my soul. The prince was immediately both intrigued and thankful for this. To men, women are for the most part mysterious and unknowable creatures, and to have one willing to explain exactly what she needed was refreshing. So he says, I would love to know what questions I must ask you, my lady. Tatterhood looks at him and says, you have never asked why I ride this goat. And the prince said, why do you ride that goat, my lady? Tatterhood winked and said, for one who has the eyes to behold it, this is not a goat at all, but a Castilian steed. And immediately in front of the prince's eyes, the goat becomes a great, stunning black horse. Also, said Tatterhood, you have never asked why I carry this wooden spoon. And the prince replies, "Why do you carry that wooden spoon, my lady?" She says, "For one who has the eyes to behold it, this is not a wooden spoon, but a silver wand." And again, suddenly, she is now holding a brilliant wand of purest silver. Finally, Tatterhood said, "You have never asked why I wear this tattered hood over my head." The prince, who by now could probably see where this was going, asked, "Why, my lady, do you wear that tattered hood over your head?" She said, "For one who has the eyes to behold it, this is not a hood, but a crown of wildflowers." And sure enough, the hood vanished and was replaced by a crown of all the blooms from the hedgerows and the meadows. More than just the goat and the wand and the hood had changed in the prince's eyes, though. Tatterhood herself appeared quite different. She looked across at the prince and said, "For those with the eyes to behold it, a goat is not a goat, a wand is not a wand, a hood is not a hood, and I am as fair as my dearest sister." And that is the end of the story of Tatterhood. Although it uses the very similar trope of the beautiful and ugly twin, right down to the beautiful sister having her head replaced by an animal head, and both stories contain strong female characters, Tatterhood is a very different kind of folktale to Kate Crackernuts, and there is so much to like about it. For starters, it's lovely the way Tatterhood, despite her abnormal looks and nature, is mostly accepted from the beginning. Her mother does bewail slightly at having birthed such a strange child, but Tatterhood is never treated poorly or even differently to her sister. She is accepted by her parents for who she is, which is a great thing. Then there's the Scandinavian style of the story, which makes it less like a fairy tale and more like a Norse epic in places. Tatterhood charging the mob of unseelie creatures on her goat, waving her wooden spoon, after giving a little rousing speech, which contains the great line, "I shall put my hand in the mouth of Fenris the wolf, and I shall not count the cost." Fabulous. The story contains some great lessons as well, like sisterhood, female empowerment, and even the risks of marrying off girls too early. Then, towards the end, we get the "don't judge looks by their cover" lesson, and the beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. Another thing I love is Tatterhood's sister gets far more character development than the pretty sister usually gets in a story like this. In Katie Crackernuts, her sister is there, and once she has her head back, she gets married at the end. But does she really learn anything? In Tatterhood, we see first that her sister's head has changed when it gets put back on. It now has 3 silver braids of hair that hang down her face. And I think that's representative of the character herself changing. She has gained knowledge and wisdom through her trial, and she is now a different and stronger person to the one that she was. And this is proven when she decides not to go home and instead to travel on with Tatterhood and have more adventures and experiences. I could talk for ages about how much and why I love the story of Tatterhood, but I think we should probably finish up now. So thank you all for joining me on this journey through 3 fascinating stories that use similar tropes and themes. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, then please like it or leave a comment. And I very much hope to see you next story.